In a grand 10th century royal court, King Lavaṇa sat on his throne when a mysterious stranger approached. Without a word, the man produced a bundle of iridescent peacock feathers and swept them in a blurring, mesmerizing motion across the king's sight. Instantly, the court vanished. Lavaṇa found himself stranded in a distant, desolate forest. Stripped of his royal identity and starving, he stumbled upon a tribal settlement. To survive, he married an outcast woman and resigned himself to a grueling life of manual labor. He lived this life for decades, raising a family and enduring the poverty of his station. But when a brutal famine struck the region and his children began to starve, the broken, desperate king built a massive wooden pyre and threw himself into the flames in absolute despair. He jolted awake, breathless. The fire was gone. He was back on his throne, surrounded by his courtiers. Looking around, Lavaṇa realized that while he had just lived a decades-long lifetime, only a few seconds had passed in the palace. The experience reveals a specific capability of the mind. It can simulate a complete, complex reality filled with passing years and physical suffering entirely within the span of a single heartbeat. Deeply unsettled by the weight of the vision, King Lavaṇa set out the very next morning. He traveled south to the physical Vindhya hills, determined to see if the landscape he had seen in his trance actually existed. He arrived at a rocky plateau and stopped. There, in the waking world, stood the exact tribal village from his vision. He recognized the huts and found his tribal mother-in-law weeping over the family he thought he had only imagined. This manuscript documents the king's impossible discovery. It describes Lavaṇa finding the exact scenes and people he knew as a tribesman. The text highlights where he meets an old woman mourning her lost husband, the husband Lavaṇa believed himself to be, proving the vision crossed into reality. This creates a foundational mystery. If a simulated reality generated in a fraction of a second exists in the physical world, it forces us to ask what actually separates waking life from a dream. These ideas are central to the Mokṣopāya, a philosophical text composed during the mid-10th century on a hill overlooking Srinagar, Kashmir. The text presents a model of a participatory universe. In this view, physical nature is not an independent, static reality. Rather, its properties are defined entirely in relation to the conscious observers experiencing it. This process is driven by Maya, or illusion. It is the power that limits pure infinite consciousness, creating the impression of individual isolated minds that see themselves as separate from the world. These limited minds act as reality simulators. Driven by internal psychological conditioning, they project their own unique sequence of time, space, and events, turning internal impressions into perceived external facts. To explain how Lavaṇa's vision matched a real village, the text uses the analogy of a crow and a coconut. A crow lands on a palm tree just as a coconut falls. The crow didn't cause the fall, but the perfect timing creates the illusion of a connection. The text argues that Lavaṇa's mind didn't create the village or travel there. Instead, his consciousness temporarily reflected events happening elsewhere, creating a perfect coincidence that the king experienced as his own life. Under this framework, time and distance are not objective constants. They are malleable projections that change based on an individual's psychological state and internal conditioning. This participatory model aligns with Yogacara Buddhism, which asserts that all that is perceived is mind, suggesting the world we see is a projection of our own cognitive processes. The Mandukya Upanishad takes this further by methodically analyzing 3 states of experience, waking, dreaming, and deep sleep, to find a single reality underlying them all. It identifies a 4th state called Turiya. This is pure, unconditioned consciousness, the silent background that remains unchanged whether we are awake or dreaming. These traditions often compare this to a pot space. The space inside a clay pot seems separate and small, but it is actually the same infinite cosmic space. In this analogy, the pot is the limited ego consciousness that makes the infinite self feel confined. Across these ancient traditions, The physical world is diagnosed as a temporary, localized enclosure of a single, infinite awareness. After seeing the real village in the Vindhya hills, King Lavaṇa arrived at a final realization about his palace life. He realized the physical body is inert. It is the mind alone that experiences hunger, suffers through famine, or feels pleasure. As this text notes, the king experienced his entire tribal life, while his physical body never left the court. This leads to the central claim of the Mokṣopāya. What we call waking life is non-different from a dream. Both are mental projections. Waking life is simply a dream that happens to be more stable over time. The text calls the ultimate reality Siddhākasha, the space of consciousness. Liberation comes when one realizes they are this infinite space, not the physical body moving through it. We are not physical beings experiencing temporary dreams. We are the infinite space of consciousness experiencing a temporary physical life. King Lavaṇa's story demonstrates that time is a psychological construct, and an entire lifetime of experience can be compressed into a literal heartbeat. But if reality is a mental projection, what happens to that projection when the physical body actually dies? Does the mind simply project a brand new dream, trapping us in an endless cycle of new lives and new identities? Well, Lavaṇa's story showed how the mind can simulate years and seconds. The next story in this tradition examines how the mind can construct an entirely new identity from scratch. Join us next time for episode 17, Gadi and the Mystery of Rebirth, where the Mokṣopāya turns to the ultimate question of memory and reincarnation.